The day Phineas Wells rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, the first thing he noticed was the smell of burned cornbread drifting from the open window of the boarding house on Chestnut Street. And the second thing he noticed was the woman standing on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold all her pieces together. He had been riding for 11 days straight from Dodge City, trailing a commission to survey fence lines for a rancher named Aldrich who owned most of the grazing land east of the Kaskaskia River. Phineas was 34 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with calloused hands and a habit of studying things longer than most men thought polite. He had surveyed half the Kansas plains and portions of the Indian Territory below, and he had learned to read land the way some men read faces, which meant he had also learned, slowly and at some personal cost, to read faces with the same precision he gave to land. The woman on the porch had the look of someone who had been standing in one place for a very long time without meaning to. He dismounted at the hitching post in front of the general store, tied his roan mare Clover, and asked the storekeeper where a man might take a room for 3 or 4 weeks while conducting survey business in the county. The storekeeper, a round-faced fellow named Hicks, pointed him directly to Sutton House on Chestnut Street without much elaboration, except to say that Letitia Sutton kept clean rooms and that the price was fair. He did not mention the cornbread. Phineas walked Clover down to Chestnut Street, and the woman was still on the porch when he arrived. Up close she was younger than he had first supposed, maybe 29 or 30, with dark auburn hair pulled back severely and gray eyes that had the quality of winter sky just before the weather turned. She was not especially tall, but she held herself upright with a kind of dignity that seemed more habit than comfort, like a person who had decided years ago that whatever else fell apart, posture would not. He introduced himself. He told her he needed a room for 3 to 4 weeks, possibly 5 if the surveys ran long. She looked at him for a moment in that still way she had, then said her name was Letitia Sutton, that she had a room available on the 2nd floor east side, that meals were included in the weekly rate, and that she expected punctuality and no drinking on the premises. He said that suited him fine. She showed him to the room herself. It was clean, as advertised, with a good mattress and a window that looked out over the back garden, where a few rows of spring vegetables were just beginning to push through the dark soil. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece in the hallway, a formal portrait of a man in his Sunday clothes, square-jawed and serious, with Letitia standing beside him in a white dress with her hands folded in her lap. The man in the photograph had kind eyes. Phineas did not ask about the photograph. He had learned enough about other people's grief to know that silence was sometimes the most respectful thing a stranger could offer. Dinner that first evening was a revelation of the wrong kind. There were 4 other boarders at Sutton House. A young telegraph operator named Chester Briggs who talked constantly about a girl in Wichita he intended to marry. A dry goods salesman named Aldous Prewitt who ate with mechanical efficiency and said nothing. A school teacher named Martha Fenn, who was in town to interview for a position at the new schoolhouse. And an elderly cattle broker named Warren Doyle, who wore the same brown vest every day and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. They all gathered at the long dining table at 6 o'clock, and Letitia brought out a supper that was technically food and nothing else. There was a beef stew that had the color and consistency of river mud, in which the carrots had surrendered entirely, and the potatoes had dissolved into something sad and formless. There was bread that had been baked correctly in shape, but had no particular flavor beyond a vague floury resignation. There was a pie on the sideboard that Chester Briggs eyed hopefully all through the meal, but which, when it was eventually cut and served, turned out to be apple in the way that water is distantly related to wine. Everyone ate without comment. Phineas suspected they had all been at the table long enough to know that comment would not improve the situation. He ate his share, because he had ridden 11 days and he was hungry enough to eat saddle leather without complaint. But he watched Letitia as she moved between the kitchen and the dining room, serving and refilling water glasses and straightening things that did not need straightening, and he noticed the particular quality of her inattention. She was not distracted the way a busy person is distracted. She was absent in a deeper way, present in the room but not really in it, going through the motions of hospitality the way someone performs a task they learned by rote long ago and no longer think about. He had seen that kind before. He had been that kind himself once, after his brother Thomas died of fever on the trail in the summer of 1876. For nearly a year afterward Phineas had done his work and spoken when spoken to, and slept and risen and surveyed land and filed reports and done every necessary thing, but it had all been hollow, like a house with no fire in the hearth. He recognized the quality in Letitia Sutton the way a man who has recovered from a particular illness recognizes the same symptoms in another. The next morning he woke at 5, which was his custom, and went downstairs to find coffee. The kitchen was already lit and Letitia was there, standing at the stove with her back to him, moving through the routine of breakfast with that same automatic competence that somehow produced food without producing nourishment. She startled slightly when he came through the door, then composed herself. He asked if he could have coffee while he looked over his survey maps before the others came down. She poured a cup without ceremony and set it on the kitchen table, and then went back to whatever she was doing, which appeared to be stirring a pot of oatmeal that smelled of nothing at all. He spread his maps and drank his coffee and said nothing for a while. Then, because he could not quite help himself, he said, "What spices do you have?" She turned from the stove and looked at him. "I beg your pardon. In your pantry," he said. "What spices have you got?" She stared at him as if he had asked her a question in a foreign language. "I have salt," she said, "and I believe there is some pepper. That is all. That is all I have needed." He looked at his coffee cup for a moment, then he looked back at her. "Would you mind terribly if I walked to the general store when it opens and purchased a few things?" She told him she did not run that kind of boarding house, that her boarders did not cook, and that if the meals were unsatisfactory, he was free to take his custom elsewhere. He said very calmly that the meals were fine, that he simply had a particular fondness for cinnamon in his oatmeal, and that he would not presume to do anything in her kitchen without her permission. He just wanted the option to add cinnamon to his own bowl in the morning, if she would allow it. There was a pause in which she seemed to weigh whether this was a reasonable request or an insult in disguise. Then she said that she supposed that was his own affair and went back to stirring. He bought cinnamon. He also bought nutmeg and dried thyme and a small tin of good ground coffee that was better than what she had been buying, and a paper of brown sugar. He placed all of it on the kitchen shelf near the stove without saying anything about it, and the next morning he added cinnamon to his oatmeal. He offered the cinnamon to Chester Briggs, who took it with visible delight, and said it was the best oatmeal he had eaten in 3 weeks. Letitia, standing at the far end of the kitchen, said nothing. But Phineas noticed that she looked at the cinnamon tin for a long moment after the boarders had gone. That week he rode out every morning to the Aldrich grazing land, and spent long days measuring and marking, and recording elevations and boundary lines. The Kansas spring was full and green, with the prairie grass coming up thick after a wet April, and the sky was enormous and clear with that particular shade of blue that exists nowhere else in the world except over flat land where nothing interrupts it for 50 miles in any direction. He found the work absorbing, as he always did. There was something deeply satisfying about bringing order to land, about making permanent and legal and exact what had previously been uncertain, about walking the ground carefully enough to know it. He returned in the evenings to Sutton House and ate whatever Letitia had made, and said very little about it. He helped Chester Briggs write a letter to his girl in Wichita, which involved considerably more effort than Chester had anticipated, because the boy had no gift for expressing his own feelings and Phineas had to coach him through it phrase by phrase. He played checkers with Warren Doyle after dinner, and listened to Martha Fenn describe the schoolhouse she hoped to teach in, and he read from the surveying journals he always traveled with, and he went to bed at 9 and rose at 5. But every morning he was in the kitchen early, and slowly, over the course of that first week, a conversation began to build between himself and Letitia Sutton. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way creeks form in dry land, one trickle finding the next until a channel exists where none was visible before. She asked him one morning where he was from originally, and he said Ohio, though he had been in Kansas for 8 years, and it felt more like home than Ohio ever had. She said she was from Missouri, that she had come west with her husband Daniel in 1876, that they had settled in Caldwell because Daniel had seen opportunity in the cattle trade that ran through the town on the Great Kishom Trail. She said the word husband the way a person says the name of a sore place, knowing the pain is coming even as they speak. He did not pry, but he remembered it. On Thursday of that first week, he came home from the survey fields to find the kitchen in a state of quiet disaster. Something had boiled over on the stove, and the smell of scorched milk filled the entire downstairs. Letitia was standing at the sink with her back to the kitchen door, very still, and he knew without seeing her face that she was either crying or very close to it. He went to the stove and moved the pot off the heat. He got a cloth and wiped up the spilled milk. He did these things quietly and without fanfare, and then he said, "It is nothing serious. Milk does that if you walk away from it." She turned around and her eyes were dry, but only barely, held dry by what he could tell was considerable effort. She said she knew that perfectly well, that she was not a child, and that she had been managing this house for 2 years on her own, and she did not need anyone to come into her kitchen and rescue her from a pot of milk. He said, "I know you do not. I just moved it off the heat." She looked at him for a moment, and he thought something shifted slightly in her expression, something almost imperceptible, like the angle of light changing by a single degree. She thanked him. She said it quietly, as if she was not entirely sure she meant to say it, and then she turned back to the sink. He got his maps and took them to the dining table and said nothing more about it. The second week, the boarders changed slightly. Chester Briggs received a reply from his girl in Wichita that made him practically levitate with happiness, and he left for Wichita on Saturday morning to propose in person, shaking Phineas's hand and declaring him the finest man he had ever met. Martha Fenn got the teaching position and moved into rooms closer to the schoolhouse. 2 new boarders arrived, a stocky man named Grover Cole who was in the cattle business, and a quiet woman named Agnes Hartwell who was passing through on her way to meet her brother in Colorado. The dynamics at the dinner table shifted accordingly. Grover Cole was a blunt and cheerful man who ate with enthusiasm and complimented the food loudly and insincerely, in the way that men in the cattle business complimented most things, which was to say it had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the habit of friendly commerce. Agnes Hartwell ate sparingly and read a small book throughout dinner, which was the kind of self-contained behavior that Phineas had always respected. The food remained, in its essential character, something that provided sustenance without pleasure. Letitia produced a chicken pie on Wednesday evening of the second week that had the chicken in it and a crust on top of it and nothing else in particular, and Phineas ate it and thought about the chicken pies his mother had made in Ohio when he was a boy, the ones with thyme and a little sage and butter worked into the crust until it shattered when you touched it. He was not a man who spent much time thinking about food. But something about this kitchen, about this woman and the way she fed people without feeding them, had begun to occupy a portion of his attention that he could not quite redirect. On Friday evening of the second week, he went to the kitchen after the boarders had dispersed and found Letitia at the table rather than the stove, sitting with a cup of cold tea and a ledger open in front of her, and he could tell by the way she was holding the pen without writing anything that the numbers in the ledger were not good. He sat down across from her without asking permission. She looked up, and for once she did not have the energy to arrange her expression into the formal composure she usually wore. He said, "Is there something I can help with?" she said. "The boarding house is my livelihood and my concern, Mr. Wells, and I do not require help." He said, "All right." And then he did not move. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that patient, unhurried quality that was one of his most fundamental characteristics, the quality that made him good at surveying land and at listening to people, which were not so different as they might appear. After a moment she said, "The roof over the north bedroom needs repair before summer, and the pump in the back garden is corroding and will need to be replaced within the year. And the price of flour has gone up considerably since January." He said, "I can look at the roof on Sunday if you like. I am handy enough with a hammer, and I know something about pumps from ranch work." She said, "I cannot pay you for that." He said, "I know, but I am staying here and I have a Sunday free and it costs me nothing but time." There was a silence. The lamp on the table threw a small, warm circle of light between them, and outside the window the Kansas evening was settling into that blue-purple dusk that came down over the prairie like a slow breath. She said, "Why are you being kind to me?" He thought about this seriously, the way she had come to understand he thought about most things. Then he said, "Because you seem like someone who has been waiting for a long time for someone to be, and I happen to be here." She looked at him for a moment more. Then she picked up her pen and returned to the ledger, and he took that as the end of the conversation and went to read in the parlor. But he noticed, before he left the kitchen, that the set of her shoulders was fractionally less rigid than it had been when he came in. Sunday he climbed onto the north side of the roof with a kit of tools he borrowed from Hicks at the general store, and spent 4 hours replacing 3 shingles and sealing a section of flashing that had lifted in the winter wind. Grover Cole, who was not a subtle man, watched from the back garden with his thumbs in his belt and said to Letitia that she had a useful boarder, which made Letitia say very precisely that Mr. Wells had been kind enough to assist, and that was all there was to it. That afternoon, after he had come down from the roof and washed up, Phineas found himself standing at the kitchen door watching Letitia attempt to make Sunday supper. She was cutting vegetables for a soup, and the vegetables were going into the pot in the order they were cut regardless of their cooking times, which meant the onions and the potatoes were going in at the same time as the carrots, which were going in at the same time as some late-tatted celery, and the whole thing was heading toward a result in which everything would be simultaneously overcooked and undercooked in different and complementary ways. He leaned against the door frame and watched. She looked up and said, "If you have something to say, Mr. Wells, say it." He said, "The onions and carrots want a head start over the potatoes." She looked at the pot. She looked at him. He said, "If you cook them all from the same start, the potatoes get soft before the onions have time to give the broth any depth. It is nothing complicated. It just requires the onions and carrots going in first, maybe 20 minutes before the potatoes follow." She said, "I know how to make soup." He said, "I know you do." Another silence. Then she said with great dignity, "How long do the carrots want?" He told her. She removed the potatoes from the pot and set them aside and began over. He watched her for a moment more and then she said, without turning around, "You can sit down if you intend to keep supervising." He sat down. He was not supervising. Or rather, he was watching not because he thought she needed correction, but because there was something about watching her move through the kitchen that he found he did not want to stop doing. She had a precision to her movements even in the midst of uncertainty, a way of handling objects that suggested someone who had once taken real pride in this work, a long time ago, and whose hands still remembered how even when the rest of her had forgotten why. The soup that evening was the best thing the boarders had eaten at Sutton House since Phineas had arrived. Grover Cole said so out loud, and Agnes Hartwell said quietly that it was very good, and Warren Doyle, who had been eating at this table for 6 months and knew the usual standard, looked at his bowl with visible surprise and said nothing at all, which was its own form of high praise. Letitia sat at the head of the table and ate her soup and said nothing. But Phineas, watching from his place at the side, saw the faintest trace of something cross her face when Warren Doyle ate his second bowl without prompting. It was not quite pleasure, not yet, but it was adjacent to it, like the first suggestion of color in a sky before the sun actually arrives. The third week brought a complication. A man named Silas Holt came to town from a ranch 12 miles south and took a room at Sutton House for what he described as business purposes. Holt was 41 and broad through the chest with a way of taking up more space than the room actually required, and he made it clear within the first 24 hours that he had a particular interest in Letitia Sutton that went well beyond the quality of her boarding house accommodations. He was not subtle about it. He complimented her at breakfast and at dinner in a way that technically referred to the food but actually referred to her, and he found reasons to be in whatever room she was in, and he had a habit of standing slightly too close when he spoke to her. Letitia handled it with the cool, contained professionalism she brought to most things, deflecting his attentions with a politeness that was really a kind of formal frost. But Phineas noticed, as he noticed most things, that she was more tense in the evenings now, that she moved through the house with a slightly greater economy of motion, like someone managing their energy against a drain. He said nothing about Holt. It was not his place. But on Wednesday evening of the third week, he was coming down the stairs when he heard Holt in the parlor say to Letitia, in a voice that was trying to be charming and landing closer to possessive, "A woman alone in a house this size could use a man's steady hand, Mrs. Sutton. It seems to me a practical consideration, leaving sentiment entirely aside." There was a pause in which Phineas, standing on the stairs, could hear the weight of Letitia's composure holding itself together by main force. She said, "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Holt. The house is quite well managed." Holt said, "Now, I do not mean to presume, but Daniel Sutton has been gone 2 years and there is no shame in a practical arrangement." Phineas came down the last 3 stairs and walked into the parlor doorway and said, addressing no one in particular and therefore everyone, "Mrs. Sutton, I wanted to ask about the pump fitting. Would this evening be a good time to discuss what parts are needed?" There was a fractional pause. Letitia turned toward him and he could see the relief in her eyes, quickly covered, like a candle flame sheltered from wind. She said, "Yes, Mr. Wells, now would be fine." Holt looked between them with an expression that was not quite anger but was related to it. He said good evening and left the parlor, and his footsteps went up the stairs with a deliberate heaviness. Letitia looked at Phineas for a moment after Holt was gone. She said, "There is no issue with the pump that requires discussion this evening." He said, "No, but there was one with the parlor." She looked at him for another moment. Then unexpectedly a very small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, the first one he had seen, and it changed her face in a way that he felt somewhere in his chest, a kind of shifting of weight, like the ground finding a new level. She said, "Thank you," he said, "of course." They stood in the parlor doorway for a moment in the lamplight, and then she said she had things to see to in the kitchen, and he said he would check on the pump fittings in the daylight tomorrow, which was not necessary, but gave both of them something to do with the moment besides stand there feeling its peculiar warmth. On Thursday morning, he arrived at the kitchen at 5 to find that Letitia had taken down the thyme and the nutmeg from the shelf, where he had placed them 3 weeks ago, and they were sitting on the counter beside the stove. She was making eggs, and there was something different in the air of the kitchen, a faintly herbal quality, almost nothing, like the suggestion of a smell rather than the smell itself. She did not say anything about it. He poured his coffee and sat down with his maps and did not say anything about it either. But the eggs at breakfast that morning had thyme in them, a careful, restrained amount, just enough to make the boarders pause over their forks with an expression of surprised pleasure. Warren Doyle actually said, "By God, those are good eggs," and then looked slightly embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. After breakfast, when the boarders had cleared out, Phineas was still at the kitchen table with his maps when Letitia came back in from the dining room. She stopped at the counter and stood with her back to him for a moment, and then she said without turning around, "I used your time." He said, "I know. How did it feel?" There was a pause. She turned around and looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "Strange. It felt strange." He said, "Strange how?" She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense that she was deciding whether to answer honestly or to retreat to the safety of a shorter, less true response. He waited, not pushing, just present. She said, "It felt like something I used to do, like remembering a language I spoke before." He said, "That sounds like a good thing." She said, "I am not certain it is." He looked at her. She had her hands braced against the edge of the counter, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window at an angle that caught the auburn in her hair and turned it briefly brilliant. And he thought that she was one of the most entirely real people he had encountered in a very long time. Real in the way that grief makes people real, stripped of everything decorative. He said carefully, because he wanted to say it right and he had been thinking about it for 2 weeks, "Mrs. Sutton, how long has it been since you cooked a meal that you actually meant to cook? Not just assembled the ingredients out of obligation, but actually intended?" She looked at him, and he could see the question land, could see it reach somewhere past her defenses. She said, "Daniel died in March of 1880, so 2 years." He said, "That is a long time to cook without meaning it." She said, "It is a long time to do many things without meaning them." He said gently, because this was the thing he had been building toward and he wanted it to land with the weight it deserved and not a pound more. "You are not feeding them, you know. The people at that table. You are going through the motions of feeding them, but you are actually feeding something else. You are feeding the grief. You are putting the plate down and the grief is eating it before it even reaches them." She stared at him. He watched her face very carefully and he saw something crack open in it, not dramatically, not in pieces, but in the way that ice cracks in early spring when the temperature has finally shifted just past the crucial degree, a fracture that was also a release. Her eyes filled with tears. Not a trickle but a sudden welling, the kind that comes when something that has been held under enormous pressure for a very long time is finally addressed with the correct words, and the body decides that now, finally, it is allowed. She did not make a sound. She simply stood at the counter with her hands pressed against it and her eyes full and her chin absolutely level, because even in this she would not entirely surrender her composure, and the tears ran down her face without permission. He did not move to her immediately. He sat for a moment and let her have it, let the crying be what it was without rushing to end it, because he had learned that grief rushed is grief that does not move through and out but instead backs up and stays. Then he stood up and walked to the counter and stood beside her, not in front of her, not crowding her, just beside her, and he said, "I am not going anywhere." And he stayed. He made coffee. He refilled her cup. He sat at the kitchen table and she eventually came and sat across from him, not looking at him directly but sitting in the same space with him, sharing the morning light and the sound of the town outside beginning its day. And she wiped her face with her apron, and he did not acknowledge it with anything more than a slight shift of his attention back to his maps, giving her the dignity of having cried without making it into a discussion. After a long time she said, "I did not mean to." He said, "I know." She said, "It is not your concern." He said, "No, but I am glad I was here." She looked at him then, really looked at him, in the full direct way that she generally reserved for business matters and the occasional necessity of asserting herself, and what was in her face was not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude, but something more complicated and less easily named, something that had in it equal parts vulnerability and recognition. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at his maps. She got up and went to the stove. That afternoon, he did not go out to the survey fields. He sent word to Aldrich's foreman that he needed a half-day for equipment maintenance and spent the afternoon at the general store, coming back with a basket that he carried to the kitchen and set on the table. Letitia came in from the back garden where she had been pegging laundry and looked at the basket. He said, "I thought, if you were willing, we might make something for supper tonight that is worth making. I do not mean to imply your cooking is bad." She said, "You have been implying exactly that for 3 weeks, Mr. Wells, in the most courteous manner I have ever encountered." He almost smiled. He said, "I have been implying that your cooking has the ingredients without the intention." Which is different. She looked at the basket. Inside it were a good cut of beef, proper dried herbs, a tin of good stock, onions, garlic, which she looked at with a slight skeptical expression, fresh bread that he had bought from the German baker on 2nd Street rather than having her make it, and butter, real butter, not the economy variety she had been buying, the good cream-yellow kind that smelled of a dairy and not of economy. She said, "Garlic," he said. "I know it is forward." She said, "Daniel used to grow it in the kitchen garden." And then she stopped, as if she had not meant to say that, and stood very still for a moment. He said, "That is good to know." She said, after a moment, he liked cooking, more than I ever did actually. When we first arrived in Caldwell, he used to make Sunday suppers that people would come for, the neighbors, anyone who was around. He had a particular way with a roast that I could never replicate. Phineas said, "What do you remember about how he did it?" She looked surprised by the question, as if she had expected him to offer condolences and redirect rather than to actually pursue the topic. She said, "He browned it first, very hot in the fat. He said that was the secret, that you had to seal it before you put it to braise. And he always put red wine in the braising liquid if he had any." Phineas said, "He was right on both counts." She looked at the beef on the table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I stopped making that kind of meal after he died because it seemed wrong to make something that was his, like wearing his coat." Phineas thought about this for a moment and then said, "I understand that, but I think there might also be a way to look at it where cooking something that he loved is not taking something from him, but adding something to the table he left behind. Keeping something of his alive in the house." She was looking at the beef. Her expression was complicated and private, and he was not entirely sure he had said the right thing, but he had said what he thought was true, and he could not do better than that. Then she picked up the beef and said, "Get me the good pan, the heavy iron one. It is on the bottom shelf of the cabinet on the left." He got the pan. They cooked together. It was not seamless. She told him things in a voice that was careful and a little formal, as if she was issuing instructions to an employee, which was both how she was comfortable and how she could manage the intimacy of standing at the same stove with a man she was still mostly uncertain about. He followed her lead without question, chopping when she directed and stirring when she asked and retrieving things from shelves. And gradually, the kitchen filled with a smell that was entirely different from anything that had come out of it in the last 2 years. A deep, savory, wine-touched warmth that crept out of the kitchen into the hallway and up the stairs, and into the dining room, and presumably, since the back door was open, out into the back garden and down the street. Grover Cole came in from outside an hour before dinner and stood in the kitchen doorway and sniffed the air with an expression of pure and simple happiness. He said, "Mrs. Sutton, what in creation have you got on that stove?" she said, with a dignity that now had something almost amused in it. "Supper, Mr. Cole." Cole said to Phineas, "Son, I do not know what you did, but I am grateful." Phineas said, "Mrs. Sutton did it. I only helped with the garlic." Cole looked between them. He was not a perceptive man about most things, but he was a rancher, and he understood the particular quality of two people who were standing in the same kitchen being careful not to look at each other too directly, and he had the wisdom to take his grateful nose and go back to the parlor. Supper that evening was a different kind of event. The braised beef came to the table in a state of rich, falling tenderness, with a sauce that had the wine and the herbs and the long hours of patient heat worked into it until it was something completely its own, and the bread from the German baker was there to receive it, and there was butter, and there were good roasted potatoes with rosemary, and everyone at the table sat down and then sat very still for a moment after the first bite, the way people go quiet when something affects them properly. Warren Doyle set down his fork and said, "Mrs. Sutton, this is the finest meal I have had in this house since I arrived." Agnes Hartwell said, "It is extraordinary." Grover Cole said nothing because his mouth was full, and he was unwilling to remedy that situation long enough to comment. Silas Holt, who was still at the table and still regarding Phineas with the particular wariness of a man who has been outmaneuvered without being able to identify exactly how, said grudgingly that it was very good, and even the grudging made it high praise. Letitia was at the head of the table in her usual chair, and she took one bite of the beef, and then she was very still for a moment. And Phineas, watching from his place at the side, saw her blink twice in rapid succession, the way a person blinks when something has gotten past their defenses before they could marshal them. He thought he understood. He thought the beef tasted like Daniel Sutton. He thought it tasted like a Sunday afternoon 12 years ago in a kitchen that no longer existed, and he thought it tasted like grief and also like something that was not grief, something further along on the road that grief eventually leads to, if you let it move. He did not look at her directly. He looked at his plate and ate and let the meal do what it was doing. After supper, when the boarders had gone to the parlor or to their rooms, he helped her clear the table. They had not discussed this, and it was not something he had done before, but it seemed like the natural continuation of what the day had been. So he stacked plates and carried them to the kitchen, and she washed, and he dried with a towel she handed him without comment. They worked in companionable quiet for a while. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning and the smell of the meal was still everywhere. She said, eventually, "My husband would have liked you." He said, "That is generous," she said. "It is true. He liked men who were direct without being aggressive. It was a quality he admired because he had it himself and he recognized it." He said, "Tell me about him." She looked at him, clearly surprised again by the directness. She said, "Most people do not ask." He said, "Most people are uncomfortable with other people's dead. I am not. Grief is just love that does not have anywhere to go. It does not frighten me." She handed him a wet plate. He dried it. She said, "He was 33 when he died. We had been married 9 years. He was not a perfect man, but he was a good one, and good men are not common enough that their loss can be absorbed easily." She paused. "He died of typhoid. There was an outbreak in the summer of 1880, and he was one of 7 in Caldwell. It took him in 11 days. He said, 'I am sorry.' She said, 'So am I.' They finished the dishes. She put the lamp down on the table and they sat for a moment, not quite having decided to stop, and the kitchen was quiet around them. He said, 'Do you have children?' She said, 'No, we hoped but it did not come, and then there was not enough time.' She said this matter-of-factly in the tone she used for most painful things, as if keeping the emotional weight out of her voice made the information lighter. It did not, but he appreciated the attempt. He said, 'I have not married. I have been on the move for most of my adult life, and I think I told myself that was the reason, but I am not sure it was.' She looked at him curiously. She said, 'What was the reason?' He said, 'I think I was waiting for something I could not quite name.' Which sounds more poetic than I intended. I just mean that I was never in the right place at the right time with the right person, and I was not willing to settle for the wrong combination." She said, "That is unusually particular for a man." He said, "My mother told me it would get me to 40 without a family, and she was not entirely wrong." She almost laughed. Not quite, but nearly, a flicker of amusement that crossed her face so quickly it was almost invisible. But he caught it, and it settled in him warmly. She stood up and said she ought to get to bed and that tomorrow was an early start. He said good night. She took the lamp and went to the door and then stopped and said, "Thank you, Mr. Wells, for today." He said, "We should do it again." She looked at him for a moment and said, "Perhaps." She went upstairs. He sat in the dark kitchen for a while listening to the prairie wind move across the town, and he thought about permanence and impermanence, and about the way some days are entirely unlike the days that came before them, not in their events necessarily, but in what they contain, the things they put in motion that were not in motion before. He thought about Letitia Sutton's hands on the handle of a cast-iron pan, and the way she had said Daniel's name like it was still a word she was learning to say in a different register. He thought that he was in considerable trouble and that he was not especially sorry about it. The fourth week in Caldwell began with a practical problem and ended with something that Phineas would later describe to himself as the moment the axis tilted. The practical problem was Silas Holt. Holt had apparently been making inquiries around town, and what he had inquired about was whether the widow Sutton had any intention of selling the boarding house, and the intelligence that had come back to him was that she had no such intention, but also that her finances were strained, and that a man with resources and the right kind of persuasion might eventually bring her around. This was the kind of reasoning that Phineas found deeply objectionable, not because it was overtly villainous. There was nothing illegal about wanting to purchase a building, but because it involved looking at a woman's vulnerability as leverage rather than as something to be treated with care. He learned about Holt's inquiries from Hicks at the general store on Monday morning, because Hicks was the kind of man who told the people he liked things he thought they ought to know, and he had apparently decided that Phineas was one of those people. Phineas came back to Sutton House and found Letitia in the parlor reviewing her ledger, and he sat across from her and said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it without feeling that I am presuming." She looked at him with those clear gray eyes and said, "Then say it." He told her what Holt was doing. He said it plainly and without dramatic framing because that was how she needed to hear things. She listened. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I see." Her voice was perfectly level. Her hands on the ledger were still. He said, "I do not think he means harm. I think he is a man who has decided what he wants and is finding what he considers to be a reasonable path to it. But you should know," she said. "Thank you, I will speak to him." He said, "You do not need me to be present." She looked at him with a slight elevation of her chin and said, "I am not without resources of my own, Mr. Wells." He said, "I know, I only offer." She spoke to Holt that evening, clearly and without theater, and told him that the boarding house was not for sale, that she was not seeking a business partner, and that if his interest in staying at Sutton House was primarily related to those considerations rather than to the quality of the accommodations, he might find alternative lodgings more suitable. Holt left the next morning, and the table was a more comfortable place without him. It was on Thursday evening of that fourth week that something shifted in a way Phineas had not entirely anticipated, though perhaps he should have. He had been out on the survey all day and returned later than usual because a fence-line dispute between Aldrich and a neighboring rancher had required him to walk an additional 2 miles of boundary to settle the question. He was tired and dusty, and he came into the kitchen to find that Letitia had held dinner past the usual hour because she had seen his horse was not at the post, and she did not know when he would return. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the plate she had set aside for him, covered with a cloth to keep it warm, and at the fact that she had waited rather than clearing the kitchen, and he felt something in his chest that was both simple and enormous. He sat down at the kitchen table and she uncovered the plate, and it was not a simple plate. It was a chicken with something slow-cooked and herb-brightened under the skin, with roasted vegetables and a proper sauce, and he looked at it and then looked at her. She was at the stove with her back to him, pretending to be occupied. He said, "Letitia." She turned around at the use of her first name, which he had not used before. He said, "This is magnificent." She said after a moment, "The thyme and the butter go under the skin before roasting. You told me that last week." He said, "I told you the method. The intention was yours." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm and the evening was quiet, and outside the window the first fireflies of the Kansas summer were beginning to appear in the back garden, small moving lights in the dark between the vegetable rows. She said, "Why does that distinction matter so much to you?" He said, "Because the intention is the thing that feeds people. The method is just the path it travels on. You can know every path in the territory and still get nowhere if you do not know where you are going." She stood very still for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was softer than her usual register, "You are not really talking about cooking." He said, "No, I am not." She looked at him for a long time. The fireflies moved outside the window. He waited. She said, "I am not certain I know how to mean things again. In the way you are describing, I am not certain the capacity has come back." He said, "I think it has. I think tonight's dinner is evidence." She said, "That is not what I mean." He said, "I know, but I think it applies to everything, not only the cooking." He paused. "I am not in a hurry, Letitia. I want you to know that. I am not going to arrive at a conclusion and demand you meet me there, but I want you to know what I think." She said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think you are the most entirely real person I have sat across a table from in as long as I can remember. And I think that for the last 4 weeks I have been waking up at 5 in the morning not only because that is my habit but because I want to see what the kitchen looks like when you are in it." She was very still. Then she sat down across from him, which she did not usually do when he was eating, and she folded her hands on the table and looked at them. She said, "Daniel has been gone 2 years. It is not so long." He said, "No, it is not long. I am not asking you to decide anything. I am asking you to know what is here." She said, "I know what is here." She said it quietly, almost to her hands. He ate his dinner in a silence that was full rather than empty, and she sat across from him with her folded hands, and the fireflies moved outside, and eventually she got up and poured him coffee and sat back down and said, "Tell me something about Ohio. I have never been further east than St. Louis." And so he told her about Ohio, and she listened, and they sat in the kitchen until 9 o'clock, which was later than either of them usually stayed up, and when she finally said good night, there was something in her voice that had not been there a month ago, a warmth that was cautious and real and beginning. The 5th week his survey was nearly complete. He had 3 more days of field work and then the final report to write and file, and after that his commission in Caldwell was technically finished. He had been thinking about this for several days with an increasing awareness of difficulty. The logical next commission was in Wichita, where a new series of land grants required surveying, and he had been planning to ride out at the beginning of June. June was 10 days away. He did not know quite what to do about this, and so he did what he usually did with problems that did not yet have solutions, which was to keep working and trust that the solution would arrive if he remained present to the question. On Tuesday of the 5th week, he and Letitia went to the market together in the morning because she needed supplies, and he had offered to carry things, which was partly true and partly an excuse to walk beside her through the market stalls in the early sunshine. The town of Caldwell in May of 1882 was a lively place, situated as it was at the end of the Kishom Trail and the beginning of the Indian Territory border, with cattle drives and trail hands and traders and settlers all moving through it in a constant warm current. The market ran down Main Street on Tuesday mornings, with farmers from the surrounding country bringing vegetables and eggs and preserved goods, and there was a man who sold smoked meats and a woman who made preserves that were famous in the county. Letitia moved through the market with a purposefulness she had not had in the beginning of the month, stopping at stalls and examining things with genuine interest rather than the mechanical efficiency of minimum necessary provisioning. She bought herbs, fresh ones since the season was right, and a good piece of smoked ham, and a jar of the famous preserves, and she asked the farmer with the early tomatoes very specific questions about variety and flavor that the farmer answered with visible pleasure at being consulted with such seriousness. Phineas walked beside her and carried things and watched her in the sunlight, and thought that she was becoming herself again in a way that was slow and tentative and very, very beautiful to witness. At the end of the market row they stopped at a stall that sold seedlings, small trays of herbs and vegetables ready for the kitchen garden, and she stood looking at them for a moment and then said, "Daniel used to grow garlic from seed every spring." He stood beside her. He said, "Do you still have the garden space?" She said, "I have not done anything with the section he used for the garlic. I left it fallow. I suppose that is foolish." He said, "It is not foolish, but it seems like it might be time." She looked at the garlic seedlings in the tray. They were small and bright green, spring-eager, and the man at the stall said they would want full sun and good drainage. She bought 3 rows worth of garlic seedlings and he carried them home. They planted them together that afternoon in the section of the kitchen garden that had been fallow for 2 years. The soil was a little compacted from disuse, and they worked it loose together with a fork and a trowel, and she showed him the proper depth and spacing with the confident authority of someone who was remembering something rather than learning it, and he followed her instruction and pressed each small plant into the dark earth. When they were done, they stood and looked at the row of planted garlic, and she said very quietly, "Daniel would have been pleased." He said, "I think so." She reached over and brushed the dirt from his knuckle with her thumb, a quick, unself-conscious gesture, and then seemed to realize she had done it and withdrew her hand. He did not make anything of it except to notice that she did not move away. On Wednesday, he filed his preliminary survey report with the county land office and learned that the Wichita Commission wanted him by the 15th of June. He had 8 days. He went back to Sutton House and sat in the parlor and thought about it. That evening after supper, when the other boarders had dispersed, he went to the kitchen and found Letitia making her preparations for the next morning, the ritual of organizing and setting out that she had begun doing now with an intention she had not had before. The kitchen smelled of the herbs she had hung to dry near the window, and there was a small pot of something on the low burner that smelled of preserves and sugar. He said, "I need to tell you something." She turned from the counter. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes, and something in her face tensed slightly, the way it does when a person is bracing for news they are not certain they want. He said, "My commission here is finished. I have a new one in Wichita beginning the 15th. She said, "I see." He said, "I do not want to go." She was very still. He said, "I want to be direct with you, Letitia, because that is what I know how to be, and I think it is what you deserve. I have been in Caldwell for 5 weeks, and in that time I have become very certain of something that I have not been certain of for a long time, which is that I have found the right place at the right time with the right person, and I would be a great fool to ride away from it without saying so." She was looking at him, and her hands were pressed flat against the counter edge in the way they pressed flat when she was managing something. He said, "I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give, but I am asking if there is a reason from your perspective to find a way to stay in contact, to return, to see where this goes with whatever time it takes." She said, after a long moment, "You are 34 years old and you have been surveying land for 8 years and traveling the territory." He said, "Yes," she said, "and you want to stay in Caldwell." He said, "I want to return to Caldwell. I want to write letters in between if you are willing. I want to come back and eat at your table and sit in your kitchen and help you plant garlic and not watch you feed grief to people who deserve better." She looked at him and her mouth curved, and then the curve became a real smile, the full one, the one he had been waiting to see since the night in the parlor with the lamp. And it was worth every moment of waiting because it transformed her face completely, gave it a light that was entirely her own. She said, "I have not written a proper letter since Daniel died." He said, "I have not received one worth reading in 8 years. We are well matched." She laughed. It was a short laugh, a surprised one, not the kind she had been building toward for a while, but the spontaneous kind that escapes before a person can curate it, and it was the most completely lovely sound he had heard in a long time. She said, "All right, Phineas Wells, write me letters." He said, "I will write you excellent letters." She said with a dignity that was now also warm, "That remains to be seen." He left for Wichita on the morning of June the 7th, which was 3 days later than his commission required, but which Aldrich's foreman had graciously accommodated, when Phineas explained the situation in terms that the foreman, who was a romantic man when pressed, found entirely sympathetic. He shook Warren Doyle's hand and bid farewell to the other boarders and tied Clover's saddlebag, and came down to the kitchen where Letitia was standing with 2 cups of coffee at 5 in the morning in the way they had begun every day for 5 weeks. He took the coffee. They stood at the kitchen table in the early light and drank it. He said, "I will write within the week." She said, "I will write back." He said, "Plant the rest of the kitchen garden while the weather is good." She said, "I know how to plant a kitchen garden." He said, "I know you do." He set down his cup. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was the most deliberate and intentional thing he had done in their entire acquaintance. And she looked at their joined hands and then looked up at him, and her expression was open in a way that she had not allowed it to be before, complicated and a little afraid and also warm, distinctly, undeniably warm. He said, "I will come back." She said, "I know." He rode out in the early morning with the Kansas prairie spread around him in its full green June beauty and Caldwell diminishing behind him, and he held the memory of that kitchen and that woman and those cups of coffee with a care that he usually reserved for his most precise survey measurements. Because some things, he had learned, you had to hold exactly right or they slipped away from you. He wrote the first letter from Wichita on the evening of his arrival. She wrote back within 4 days, a letter that began with a formal, careful paragraph about the boarding house and the kitchen garden, and ended with 2 sentences that were different in quality from everything preceding them, sentences that were direct and unguarded in the way he recognized as her truest register when she allowed herself to use it. She said that the kitchen smelled of herbs now in the morning in a way that she found she had come to rely on. She said she had made the braised beef on Sunday and Warren Doyle had eaten 3 portions. He read those 2 sentences 4 times. He wrote back the next day. The letters got longer as the weeks went on. The Wichita Commission took 6 weeks, not 4, because of complications with a disputed land grant that required additional surveying and a subsequent appearance before the county land court. He wrote to Letitia about the complications without excessive complaint, and she wrote back with the kind of dry, precise sympathy that he had come to associate with her at her most real. And the letters passed between Caldwell and Wichita like a conversation that was building something slowly and surely. She told him that the garlic was growing beautifully. She told him that she had hired a young woman named Clara to help with laundry twice a week, which had been a financial stretch, but which was practically necessary. She told him that she had made the chicken with herbs under the skin 3 times and was beginning to feel confident about it. And she told him about a meal she had made on a Tuesday for no reason except that she had wanted to. A lamb stew with rosemary and white beans that had taken all afternoon, and that she had eaten alone at the kitchen table with a glass of water and found, for the first time in a very long time, completely satisfying. He wrote back, "A meal you make for yourself because you want to make it is not loneliness. It is self-sufficiency. It is the proof that the intention has come back all the way. I am glad you are feeding yourself, Letitia. I am glad the kitchen is yours again." She wrote, "You have a way of saying the right thing in an infuriating number of words. I prefer it to saying the wrong thing in fewer. Come back when you can." He came back on a Thursday in the last week of July. He rode into Caldwell in the afternoon heat, with the dust of the road on him and the town shimmering slightly in the July warmth. And he dismounted at the hitching post on Chestnut Street and walked Clover down and tied her at the post in front of Sutton House. And he stood for a moment looking at the house with its clean white paint and its vegetable garden visible through the side gate. Letitia came out of the front door before he had finished looking. She had apparently seen him from the window, because she was already coming down the porch steps with her hands clasped in front of her in that contained way she had, and she walked toward him across the small front yard and stopped when she was a yard away. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was different from how she had been in May and not different, and the combination of those 2 things was the most interesting thing he had looked at in 6 weeks, which was saying something for a man who had spent 6 weeks looking at the Kansas landscape in professional detail. She said, "You look dusty." He said, "I am dusty. I have ridden 11 hours." She said, "There is a room available on the 2nd floor." He said, "The East Room." She said, "The East Room." He said, "I would like to stay for a while." She said, "How long is a while?" He said, looking at her steadily. "I was hoping we could discuss that." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Come in then. I am making supper and it will be ready at 6." He followed her into the house, and the smell of the kitchen reached him from the hallway. Something long cooked and savory and alive with herbs, and Clover was tied at the post, and the summer sun was making long gold shadows across Chestnut Street, and he thought that there was nowhere on the Kansas plains he would rather be than exactly here. Over the following weeks, Phineas took no new commission and did not look for one. He told himself initially that this was because he needed to reorganize his survey equipment and write up the Wichita report and file the necessary paperwork with the land office in Topeka, all of which was true. But the truth beneath those truths was simpler and more complete. He was in Caldwell because Letitia Sutton was in Caldwell, and he could not make himself be anywhere else. He did useful things. He fixed the pump. He repaired the fence at the back of the kitchen garden. He drove Letitia to the market on Tuesday mornings in the boarding house's small wagon and carried things, and learned the names of the farmers she bought from. He took over Warren Doyle's checkers sessions after the old cattle broker departed for Texas in mid-August. He helped a new boarder, a young schoolteacher named James Ellery, negotiate the purchase of a horse from a trader who had been trying to pass off an animal with a bad left foreleg, which saved Ellery a considerable amount of money and earned Phineas a degree of goodwill that spread through the small community of Sutton House's residents. But mostly he was in the kitchen in the mornings at 5, and he was at the dinner table in the evenings, and he was present in the way that presence, when it is consistent and honest and does not ask for more than it offers, can become something that a person comes to rely on without quite deciding to. One evening in the second week of August, he was sitting at the kitchen table after dinner writing a letter to his brother's wife in Ohio, whose annual note he had been negligently late in answering, when Letitia came in from the parlor and sat down across from him with a cup of tea and a piece of mending, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the most completely natural silence he had ever sat in. After a time she said, "You have not taken a new commission." He said, "No." She said, "You have been here 3 weeks." He said, "Yes." She said, "A surveyor does not typically remain in one town for 3 weeks without employment." He said, "No." She set down her mending and looked at him directly. She said, "Phineas, what are we doing?" He set down his pen. He looked at her. The kitchen lamp was burning low and the August night was warm and the house was quiet around them. He said, "I think we are doing what people do when they find they want to be in the same place and the same kitchen and the same quiet evenings. I think we are doing something that deserves a name." She said, "Give it one." He said, "I would like to court you, Letitia Sutton. Formally, properly, in whatever way is comfortable to you, with your permission and at whatever pace you need, because I intend to ask you to marry me at some point in the not extremely distant future, and I would like there to be no ambiguity about what I am and what I am here for." She sat very still. He watched her face move through several things in rapid succession, surprise and something tender and something that looked like it might be relief, as if she had been wondering and had needed to stop wondering. She said, "You intend to ask me?" He said, "Yes," she said, "but not tonight." He said, "Not tonight. Tonight I am asking your permission to court you, which is a different question." She said, "And if I say yes," he said, "then I will go find a surveying commission in the Caldwell area and make myself a permanent part of the county, and I will come to your table and sit in your kitchen and fix things that need fixing and be here in the morning, and I will ask you to marry me when the time is right and I believe you are ready." She looked at him for a long time. The mending sat in her lap and the tea steamed gently in the cup. She said, "The time might be sooner than you are calculating." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "That is a yes." He took her hand across the table, and this time she turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat together in the warm kitchen in the late August night, and the lamp burned, and the Kansas dark settled around the house, and he thought that this, exactly this, was the destination he had been surveying toward his whole life without knowing the name of it. He found the surveying commission 3 days later, a long-term contract to survey and map the entire Sumner County for the state of Kansas, which was a project of at least 18 months and possibly 2 years, and which the county land office had been looking to fill with a reputable surveyor. He signed the contract on a Thursday morning and came back to Sutton House and told Letitia at the kitchen table over morning coffee, and she listened and said, 18 months. And he said, at least. And she said, in Caldwell. And he said, yes. And she said, well then, in a tone that suggested that this was entirely satisfactory but that she had expected nothing less, which was the tone she used when she was pleased but was not going to demonstrate it excessively. The courtship that followed was one of the most quietly happy periods of Phineas's life. He brought her things from the market when he passed through on survey days. He danced with her at the Harvest Social in September, a real dance, fiddles and a dance caller and the Caldwell Community Hall lit with paper lanterns, and she danced with a grace that surprised him pleasantly, and she laughed genuinely twice, which he counted as a triumph. He read to her on the evenings when the other boarders had retired from whatever he had been reading, and she listened and sometimes argued and sometimes agreed, and the arguments were the best part because her mind was precise and original, and she was not afraid to say when she thought he was wrong. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday evening in October when the cottonwood trees along the Chestnut River had turned gold, and the air had that blue-edged quality that Kansas autumn air has, clean and cool, and carrying the smell of harvest. He had asked her to walk with him by the river after supper, which she had done with a composure that suggested she knew what was coming, and when they were standing on the bank watching the gold leaves shake in the wind off the prairie, he turned to her and took both her hands and said what he had been thinking about saying for 3 months. He said, I love you, Letitia. I have loved you since the morning you first used the thyme and didn't tell me about it, but I could smell it in the eggs. I want to marry you and share your kitchen and plant garlic in the spring, and put the intentions back in the house alongside the good cast iron and the herbs. I want to be here. She was looking at him with those clear gray eyes full of everything she felt, and this time she did not hold it back. This time the tears that came were not the grief tears she had cried in the kitchen months ago, but something lighter and warmer, and she said, yes, Phineas, I want you to be here too. He kissed her then, there by the river with the gold cottonwood leaves falling, and the Kansas sky enormous and blue overhead, and she kissed him back with a warmth and a certainty that told him everything he needed to know about whether the capacity had come back all the way. It had. They were married in December of 1882 at the Caldwell Methodist Church by a minister who was new to the town but who conducted a very good ceremony, which was all they required. Warren Doyle returned from Texas for the occasion, having received a letter from Phineas that he described as the best surveying of a situation he had ever read. Chester Briggs came from Wichita with his now wife, the girl he had written the letter to, and she was exactly as described, warm and lively, and she and Letitia took to each other immediately in the way of people who are both practical about life. Hicks from the general store attended and gave them a substantial gift of kitchen supplies, which was exactly appropriate. James Ellery, the schoolteacher with the rescued horse, was there with Martha Fenn, who had returned to Caldwell when the schoolteacher position became permanent, and who was now keeping company with Ellery in a way that suggested the next Caldwell wedding was not far off. Letitia wore a dress of deep blue-green that she had made herself over 4 evenings of after-supper work, and she looked so entirely, precisely herself in it, so present and real and alive, that Phineas stood at the front of the church watching her walk up the aisle and felt something in his chest that was beyond the capacity of survey measurements to describe. They said their vows in clear voices in the small, warm church, and he put a ring on her finger that had been his mother's, sent from Ohio when he wrote to tell his family he was marrying a widow in Kansas, and his mother's letter back had said that any woman who could bring a wandering surveyor to rest in one county was a woman of unusual gifts, and that she looked forward to meeting her. The wedding supper was at Sutton House, which had been closed to outside boarders for the weekend, and Letitia had cooked it herself. She had been at it for 2 days, and what came to the table was nothing short of remarkable: a roast that fell apart at the touch, and a soup of white beans and rosemary, and bread from the German baker elevated with butter and garlic, and 3 pies that were each entirely themselves, apple and pear, and a custard that made Chester Briggs close his eyes briefly in sincere gratitude. Phineas sat at the head of the table with his wife beside him, and looked down the length of it at the people gathered, the friends accumulated over months of a life being rebuilt and remade, and he thought of the first evening he had sat at this table, and eaten the gray stew and watched Letitia move through the kitchen like someone performing a duty in a place she had vacated inside, and he looked at her now, flushed with the work and the pleasure of it, her hand warm in his under the table. And he thought that the distance between those 2 versions of the same kitchen was the whole of what love could do when it was patient and present, and did not flinch from what it found. He raised his glass. He said in a voice for the whole table, "To my wife who can feed people now that she is feeding herself." There was laughter and there was the sound of glasses, and Letitia looked at him with her full real smile, the one that reached her eyes and changed her face entirely, and she said quietly, just for him, "You are an infuriating number of words, Phineas Wells." He said, "You married me anyway." She said, "I did." He said, "How do you feel about it?" She looked at him, and the lamplight was warm on her face, and the table was full, and the kitchen smelled of everything they had made together, and she said, "Ask me in 40 years." The spring of 1883 was the most alive that Phineas had felt in any spring he could remember, and he had spent many springs outdoors on the Kansas plains in direct contact with its particular violent beauty. But there is a difference between witnessing a spring and inhabiting one, and he was inhabiting this one in a way he had not inhabited anything in a long time. He and Letitia planted the kitchen garden together in April, the full extent of it, with the garlic going in first because it needed the longest growing time, and she directed the placement of everything with the authority of someone who had been thinking about it all winter, and he followed her instructions without comment, and they worked in the warm spring dirt until the garden was laid out in its rows, and the early evening light was making everything gold. She was expecting their first child, a fact they had known since February and had discussed with the same direct calm that they brought to most things, which is to say with happiness underneath the calm, happiness that was steady and real rather than performed. The boarding house was still running, because it was her livelihood and her work, and she had no intention of giving it up simply because she had a husband, which she had made clear before they were married and which he had understood and agreed with entirely. He contributed to the household with his survey income, and she ran the house and the boarding operation, and they were partners in the full sense of the word, both bringing what they had. In the early mornings, before the boarders were up, they had the kitchen to themselves. Coffee and maps and the morning light and conversation that ranged over everything, the survey work and the boarders and the garden and the news from the wider world, the rail lines expanding westward, the ongoing complications of the territory across the southern border, where the 5 civilized tribes were managing the pressures of federal policy with varying degrees of success. He had surveyed portions of the Indian Territory in his earlier years, and he held a particular respect for the complexity of those communities, and a particular distaste for the federal government's habit of remaking prior agreements whenever they became inconvenient. He said so when the topic came up bluntly, because that was how he said things. Letitia, who had grown up in Missouri and had come west young enough to have formed her views here rather than bringing them fully made from elsewhere, listened to him and asked questions and formed her own conclusions, which were sometimes identical to his and sometimes differently nuanced, and the discussions were always interesting. The summer advanced. His survey of Sumner County was going well, about a third complete by July, and the familiarity with the land he was building was the kind where the ground becomes personal, where you know a particular rise or a particular creek bend the way you know a neighbor's face. In September of 1883, their son was born. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in the first week of September, a full-term and healthy boy, assisted by the midwife Clara Hart, who had been delivering babies in Caldwell since before the town had its current name, and who handled the whole business with magnificent competence. Phineas was in the house, not in the room because that was the midwife's judgment, but close enough that when Clara Hart opened the bedroom door and said the baby had arrived and both mother and child were well, he had tears on his face before he was fully through the door. Letitia was sitting up in the bed with the baby in her arms, and she looked at Phineas when he came in with an expression that had in it every version of herself she had ever been: the grief-hollowed widow and the careful boarding housekeeper, and the woman who had stood in the kitchen learning to intend things again, and the woman by the river with the gold leaves falling, all of them present at once, and added to all of them something new, something that had not existed before this moment. She said, "Come and see your son." He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small face, red and sleep-creased and entirely perfect, and he thought that of all the landscapes he had surveyed in his life, this small face was the most extraordinary territory he had ever had the privilege to stand at the edge of. He said, "What shall we call him?" She looked at the baby. She said, "I would like to call him Daniel, if you do not mind, after his grandfather in spirit though not in blood." She paused. "And James for a middle name after your brother." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his wife and his son in the September morning light, and he said, "Daniel James Wells, that is a good name." Said, "I think so." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, and she leaned against him, and the baby slept between them with the perfect unconscious confidence of someone who has arrived in exactly the right place. Warren Doyle, who somehow always knew about the important things even from Texas, sent a letter 3 weeks later that congratulated them on the birth, and said it was the most welcome news he had received since the invention of good whiskey, which was the highest compliment available to him. Chester Briggs wrote that his own wife was expecting in the spring, and that he expected their children to be fast friends. Martha Fenn, who had indeed married James Ellery in the spring of 1883, sent a practical gift of baby clothes with a note in her schoolteacher's hand that was full of warm feeling. The boarding house went on. The kitchen went on. The survey of Sumner County went on. The letters back and forth to Ohio and Wichita and Texas went on. The Tuesday mornings at the market went on, with a baby in a basket now, whom the market farmers greeted with the warm, proprietary attention that communities give to the children born within them. The garlic came up in the kitchen garden in the spring of 1884, the second planting of it, thick and strong, and Letitia stood in the garden with Daniel James on her hip and looked at the green shoots and said nothing out loud. But Phineas, who was standing behind her, saw her touch one of the green tips gently with one finger and felt the weight and the lightness of the moment equally and said nothing either, because some things are complete without annotation. They planted 2 more rows that year, and the year after that 3 more. By 1885, the boarding house at Sutton House had a reputation that extended well beyond Caldwell, not primarily for its prices or its location, which were ordinary, but for the food, which had become extraordinary. Word traveled along the cattle trails and the rail lines the way word does in open country, person by person, rider by rider, until there was a class of traveler who specifically sought out Chestnut Street, not because it was the best-priced lodging in Caldwell, but because of what came out of that kitchen. Letitia's braised beef had achieved a kind of local legend, and her chicken on Sundays, and the soups of autumn and the preserves of summer and the bread that she had graduated from buying to making, a proper yeast-risen bread worked with butter and herbs that had nothing in common with the floury resignation of the first weeks of Phineas's stay. She did not talk about it much. She cooked because she meant it, because she had found the intention again and kept it, and the food reflected that meaning in the way that all made things reflect the attention of their maker. In the autumn of 1885 she was expecting again, and this time they knew earlier, and the knowing made the autumn more golden, the kitchen more inhabited, the Tuesday markets more full of possibility. Phineas had by this time completed the Sumner County survey and been offered, and accepted, the position of official county surveyor, a permanent salaried appointment that meant no more long commissions away from home, no more 11-day rides and letters substituting for presents. He came home every evening. He was in the kitchen every morning at 5, and now she was there too, because Daniel James, who was 2 years old and completely resolute about everything, woke at 5 like his father and came downstairs on his unsteady legs with an expression of tremendous purpose and demanded the attention of both of them. The second child, a boy again, arrived in April of 1886, on a warm spring morning with the kitchen garden just beginning to show its first green. They named him Thomas Hicks Wells, Thomas for Phineas's brother and Hicks because, as Phineas said when he suggested it, a man who points you toward the right boarding house at the right moment in your life deserves some kind of monument, and Hicks had cried openly when informed of the honor, and then denied it to everyone who mentioned it, which they found entirely endearing. 2 boys in a small house is a particular kind of abundance. Loud and physical and full of a forward momentum that the house had not previously contained, the energy of small people who are entirely committed to being exactly what they are without apology. Phineas watched his sons with a delight that was constant and sometimes exhausted and always grateful, and he watched Letitia with them, the way she moved between firmness and warmth with the same precision she brought to everything, and he thought that the quality she had been feeding all those months in the beginning, the grief that had been eating everything she made before it reached the table, had been entirely replaced by something that could actually absorb what she gave it. She was not a changed woman, not in the essential sense. She was still precise and direct, and not given to excessive decoration of either her house or her sentences. She still held herself with that upright dignity that was more habit than effort. She still took money and household mathematics seriously and kept her ledger with scrupulous care. But she was present in a way she had not been in those early weeks, present in the full sense, in the kitchen and in the house and in her life, the lights on behind the windows. One evening in the summer of 1886 Phineas came in from a day of county work to find the kitchen in a state of organized abundance, every surface occupied with something at some stage of preparation, a roast in the oven, a soup on the low burner, bread on its final rise under a cloth, a pie on the sideboard with its lattice crust waiting to be sugared. 2 boarders were staying at the house that week, a traveling judge and a cattle broker from Abilene, and Daniel James was sitting at the kitchen table, very seriously, eating a piece of bread, and Thomas was in the basket near the window not sleeping, but observing his brother with an alert gravity remarkable in a 3-month-old. Letitia was at the stove with her back to the door and she was humming. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and listened to her hum, a wordless tune he half recognized from the Harvest Social 3 years ago, low and private and entirely unself-conscious, the kind of humming a person does only when they are deeply, functionally happy and don't know they're doing it. He said, "That smells like Sunday." She turned around with a wooden spoon in her hand and looked at him and said, "It is Thursday." He said, "The kitchen does not know that." She looked at the kitchen, at the organized abundance of it, and he saw something move across her face that was complex and warm and at peace in a way that the face he had watched in those early weeks could not have produced. She said, "I made too much. I always make too much now." He said, "You are making up for lost time." She said, "I suppose I am." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, right there among all the cooking, with Daniel James watching from the table with the focused attention of a 2-year-old attempting to categorize the behavior of adults, and she kissed him back and then said, "Go wash. Supper in 20 minutes." He washed. They ate. The traveling judge said it was the finest meal he had eaten between Topeka and Texas and asked for the bread recipe. And Letitia gave it to him without hesitation, because she had learned over the past 3 years that good recipes are not diminished by being shared, that there is enough kitchen in the world for everyone. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because no years are. The winter of 1887 was hard, the coldest in Sumner County's recorded memory, and there were weeks of deep snow that kept everyone indoors and taxed the coal supply, and made the boarding house a kind of shelter that it had not been designed to be, receiving neighbors and travelers alike with whatever warmth and food it could provide. Phineas spent those weeks doing county work from home and helping keep the house, and feeding the animals and reading to his sons by the fire in the long evenings. There were boarders who were difficult, and boarders who were delightful, and boarders who left without paying, which happened twice, and which Letitia handled with a cool and implacable pursuit of the relevant legal remedy that achieved resolution both times because the county judge had eaten at her table and held her in the very highest regard. There was a dry summer in 1888 that hurt the vegetable garden and required the kitchen to adapt, which it did, because adaptation was by now one of its essential qualities. And there was the morning in the spring of 1889 when Letitia stood in the back garden looking at the garlic rows with an expression he knew, a private expression, and he came to stand beside her and she said, "He has been gone 9 years. He stood with her. She said, "It does not hurt the same way anymore. I want you to know that. It is not that it is gone. It is that it has found a different place to live." He said, "I know." She said, "I am telling you because I want you to know that you did not replace something. You added to something." He said, "I know that too." She took his hand. They stood in the garden with the spring wind moving over the Kansas plains and the garlic bright green in its rows, and the kitchen visible through the open back door with its smells and its warmth. And Daniel James called out from somewhere inside the house wanting his breakfast. And Thomas echoed him a moment later with the determination of a 3-year-old who has heard his brother make a successful demand and sees no reason not to duplicate it. Letitia laughed, full and real and entirely present. She said, "I suppose we should feed them." He said, "I suppose we should." They went inside together, into the warm kitchen, into the smell of coffee already made and bread from yesterday still good, and the spring morning laying its particular light across the floor. And she went to the stove, and he got the coffee, and Daniel James came padding in his bare feet with his father's eyes and his mother's exactness about everything. And Thomas followed at a run, and the kitchen was full of all of them. Full of intention and warmth, and the particular rich ordinary abundance of a life that had been pulled back from the hollow place and given its meaning again. She made the eggs with thyme. She had made them every morning for 6 years now, a small, consistent act. The thyme from her own garden dried the summer before and crumbled between her fingers into the cast iron pan, and the smell of it was by now simply the smell of morning, the smell of the kitchen, the smell of what it meant to be exactly here and exactly meaning it. Phineas drank his coffee and watched his wife cook breakfast, and watched his sons eat with the uncritical enthusiasm of small children, who have never eaten a meal made without intention, and therefore have no idea that such a thing is possible. And he thought that he had spent 20 years surveying the Kansas plains, and finding the exact measure and boundary of every piece of land he touched, and that none of it had prepared him for the extraordinary specific territory of this kitchen, this woman, this life. But then again, he thought, finishing his coffee as Daniel James demanded more eggs and Letitia obliged without ceremony, and Thomas knocked his cup over, and the kitchen descended briefly into the cheerful chaos that was now its most common state. All good survey work is really just the process of learning to see clearly what was always already there. He had just needed to stay long enough to take the full measure of it, and he had stayed. He had stayed, and the kitchen smelled of thyme, and Letitia Sutton Wells was feeding people at her table with her whole heart, And there was nowhere in all the wide mapped Kansas plains that was better than this. And he knew it down to the bone the way a surveyor knows the truest measurement. The one that does not shift when you look away from it. The one that holds.